All right, this is the last section of this chapter, and we're going to talk now about social or observational learning. And there's mainly two studies that I want to talk about here and kind of get into to kind of demonstrate this. So the first one here is looking at Tolman, who actually looked at this idea of latent learning in rats. And so what he did is he created a maze for these rats to kind of explore and analyze. And he wanted to see if the rats were sort of learning the maze or if they were just kind of exploring. And early on, there was no motivation, there was no food presented, there was nothing to kind of guide them to a specific location within the maze. They just kind of were placed in the maze and explored as they went. And what's really interesting is that then he kind of took them out and presented some goals, some food, some objective in the maze, and looked to see if the rats who just sort of were randomly exploring were faster at following and solving the maze than those that had never done that before. And so what he found was that the rats that had been exploring were actually learning and mapping the maze so that they were able to solve it in a faster time than those that hadn't explored the maze. And so while this might seem maybe a little intuitive or maybe a little obvious in nature, the really kind of interesting piece of this is that this learning took place even though it wasn't really, there was no goal in mind and it wasn't obvious that the learning was taking place. So this is this idea of latent learning where the learning happens and the rats were able to sort of find their way through the maze because they had learned it, even though there was no sort of main goal or main objective for doing so. And this happens all the time. We have so many examples of latent learning sort of just in our own lives and our own experiences. But this idea I think is really cool, and just observing, just sort of being present and observing sort of what's going on, we do retain that information and we do learn that information. And this was just a really sort of simple and explicit way of demonstrating that sort of in a laboratory setting. The next study I want to talk about here is Bandura and his social learning, specifically using the Bobo doll. So if anybody is not familiar with this, the Bobo doll experiments are interesting because they really kind of looked at this idea of children observing adults and kind of mimicking their behavior. And so in this example, in this study, what they would do is they would have adults come in and they would interact with this Bobo doll in different ways. Some of them would be violent towards this doll and hit the doll or say things to the doll that were mean. And then the children would watch this take place, and we would see if the children would observe and kind of mimic this behavior. And most of the children did mimic the behavior. And so this really provided clear evidence for this idea of social learning, or again, observational learning, where children and even us as adults learn by observing the actions of others taking place. And so Bandura kind of had these four main kind of stages or pieces of observational learning that take place. That being attention. So they must first just pay attention. They must observe what's actually going on and sort of, see what that behavior is. The second being retention. They must remember that behavior. They must take it in and keep it in their mind. Then they have the third stage of production, where they actually then produce that behavior and they, do it themselves. And then the third one is motivation. So they sort of see what the consequence of that behavior was. Was it a positive or negative consequence? And that can reinforce that behavior to occur more or less in the future. So again, this idea here really just emphasizes that children do observe, they do watch, and they do learn through this observational method. And while this was demonstrated with children, even adults do engage in this observational and social learning in a lot of aspects of our lives.